I need the microphone. Welcome to the Tenement Museum. My name is Laura Lee, and I manage the Tenement Talks program and a lot of the public programs that we have at the museum. Really happy to see all of you here, and happy to have our guest panelists here as well. This is a talk that we're really excited to host, thinking about domestic workers and what that means and what the politics are around it. Here at the museum, we tell the stories of the immigrant and migrant families who made homes on Orchard Street. So we tell very specific stories about specific people. And one of the earliest stories we tell is that of an Irish immigrant woman named Bridget Moore who lived at 97 Orchard Street. She came here as a single woman in 1863 at a time when by far most Irish women who were working in service as domestic servants in homes. Bridget arrived 2 years before the man who would be her husband got here. We don't know what she did for those 2 years, but knowing how common this work was, we often think about what her experience would have been like working in service, what the discrimination she would have faced, and what maybe even agency she would have had in that position. And at the museum, we strive to connect past and present. So I'm really excited to have a panel that really will allow us to do that through history and talking about the history of domestic work. So what I'm going to do is just briefly introduce everyone on stage, then I will let them take over. But after they have shared their knowledge with us, we're going to open it up to you all. We want to know what questions you have, what stories that you want to share, so please don't be shy about joining in the conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to start in order of who you'll be hearing from. So first we have Andrew Urban, who is an Associate Professor of American Studies and History at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. His first book, Brokering Servitude, examines how federal immigration policies and private entrepreneurs shaped labor markets for domestic service in the 19th and early 20th century United States and dictated the contractual conditions under which migration occurred. Next to Andy, we have Vanessa May, who is an Associate Professor of History at Seton Hall University, where she also co-directs the Women and Gender Studies program. Vanessa is the author of Unprotected Labor, Household Workers, Politics, and Middle-Class Reform in New York, 1870 to 1940. Next to Vanessa is Premilla Nadasen. She is a professor of history at Barnard College and president-elect of the National Women's Studies Association. She's the author of the award-winning Welfare Warriors, the Welfare Rights Movements in the United States, and most recently, Household Workers Unite, the untold story of African-American women who built a movement. She writes and speaks widely on issues of race, labor, feminism, and social policy, and has been engaged with social justice activism for many years. And last but not least, we have Christine Lewis. Christine is a Jill of many trades. She is a worker leader, activist, advocate, member, secretary, cultural organizer with Domestic Workers United, who are nannies, housekeepers, and elderly caregivers, primarily immigrant women of color, who for the past 17 years have contributed to the domestic workers' rights movement by encouraging arts and culture as the strongholds in the work for social justice and understanding how important art and culture is to movement building. A multidisciplined performing artist, Christine has pulled from her calypsonian roots and skills as a steel drum player, spoken word artist, actress, and published poet to get her message out and build power. Thank you all for being here. And Andrew, I'm going to turn it over to you.
And so, I'm sorry, which button? Just the main one?
The forward arrow, I believe.
Okay, great. I'll figure it out. So I just want to actually begin by thanking Laura Lee for organizing this event. I actually worked at the Tenement Museum during the early 2000s, so and some of the research that I conducted while I was here actually went into the script that became the Irish apartment tour and so forth. And so, you know, in some ways working here in the early 2000s and thinking about Irish immigration through the lens of the museum inspired me to explore the political economy of domestic labor once I got to graduate school. And so, you know, it's great to be back here for the event. So tonight, I just want to use the short time I have to really emphasize two main points that I think characterized how immigration and migration policies shaped labor markets for domestic service in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And so my first major point is household employees consistently look to the state to provide them with new sources of labor, migrants who could then be deployed to fix problems that capital saw in respect of the social relations of production in the home. So in other words, migrants were understood as this untapped labor supply. Employers were deeply suspicious of domestics being too free. And in some ways, this is most evident in the ways in which the contractual arrangements that migrants entered into, when promised, for instance, transportation assistance, social relief, or wages, became devices then for ensuring or guaranteeing that third-party employees had a captive supply of laborers, servants who were bound by debt or obligation, legal or informal, to remain with the people who had paid for them to come to them. The overly independent servant clashed with the vision of the job as one of gendered and racialized dependency, where civility was demonstrated by ceding control over one's time. For instance, live-in servants were rarely, if at all, ever off work. Over dress, servants often had to wear uniforms, and over the methods and means of production, how a room was to be cleaned or a meal to be prepared, or again, the types of autonomy servants were expected to yield or give up. In respect to wage labor, by 1850, employers' concerns about immigration and domestic service had coalesced around problems posed by Irish servants, essentialized in the stereotypical figure of Biddy, who were depicted as being insolent, rebellious, too demanding. Forgot to show you my title spot. And so, for instance, I'll show you this illustration that appeared in Harper's Weekly in 1863, or I should say cartoon, titled The Present Intelligence Offices, where the whole conceit of the comic, the joke, in other words, is that this houghty Irish domestic servant is interviewing prospective employers. So in this case, Mr. Blackstone, who comes to her, lays out his credentials, tries to convince her that he's a good employer, that she should come work for him. And in part, this was just an immediate byproduct of a mass influx of Irish immigrants who, because there were so many, because domestic servants were so coveted by the growing middle class of Manhattan and Brooklyn in the 1860s and 1870s, that they in some ways did have an ability to determine what the conditions of their work would be, or at least to pick among the best of possible employers. By the 1870s, Castle Garden, the immigration station at the lower tip of Manhattan that handled immigrants entering through New York until 1891, had gained a reputation as a place where lazy Irish, quote, bummers, as they were called, gathered at the facility's labor exchange to either hatch criminal plots against their middle-class Protestant American households that they might be employed in, or to pretend that they were new immigrants, where allegedly if a former employer had given them a bad character reference, they could pretend to be newly arrived from Ireland and therefore lacking in that labor passport, as it was called in the 19th century altogether. And so, for instance, in 1876, as part of a kind of ongoing dispute between various employees at the Castle Garden Labor Exchange, one employee allegedly began creating a list of Irish servants who were abusing the services of that facility. So this is just names of various Irish women who, again, allegedly had used the labor exchange to be placed in homes where they could rob their employers, or because they were fired multiple times, returned to it to be placed again. And the perception was that this was a product of giving immigrants too much freedom, too much liberty, too much control over the terms of how they contracted their labor. This is not to say that Irish servants did not have their defenders. In the case of the Castle Garden Labor Bureau, the New York State Assemblyman John E. Devlin, a Democrat and a child of Irish immigrants himself, claimed that it was employers who were to be blamed for violating the spirit of honest contract by abusing the employment at will doctrine that governed labor contracts. Devlin asked the individual who helped compile this list whether anyone had ever bothered to ask why Irish immigrant women, quote, left their places where they were employed. Devlin continued to say, there are a good many people in New York that employ women and keep them a couple of weeks and then say they misbehave themselves and discharge them so as to save paying their wages. It was common knowledge, Devlin continued, that many employers discharged domestics after 2 weeks of service. Importantly, that was a cutoff right before they became eligible to potentially sue in civil court for quantum merit damages or wages that had been stolen from them that they otherwise could be able to recover, right? And so in Devlin's opinion, the labor exchange is not this kind of festering den for criminals, but a location where Irish women could kind of organize and better demand fair contractual conditions for their labor. During the Civil War, the dispatches that Union officers and soldiers sent, in addition to the reports that Northern journalists and missionaries filed, brimmed with enthusiasm about the productive value of contraband labor. So by the time we get to the 1860s, the kind of angle that middle-class employers in cities like New York begin to take is that they can displace obstinate Irish servants by contracting newly emancipated or freed African-American women from southern locations. And so in these terms, the humanitarian crisis of sudden emancipation became an opportunity of political economy. Writings from this period illustrate that many white Northerners viewed emancipated slaves as a distinct species of labor, whose value came from the fact they were unacculturated to the free labor system. In July 1861, with the conflict only 3 months old, the Independent magazine proclaimed that the, quote, troublesome experience of Northern households was on the verge of being transformed. The immigration of runaway slaves, with their peculiar talent for service, the magazine boasted, represented a type of spoils of war. And I'll show you, for instance, another kind of document that kind of gets at this, and this is actually an application blank that one of the predecessors to the Federal Freedmen's Bureau created. So if you were, again, a middle-class household in Brooklyn or Manhattan, you could essentially apply for a refugee woman or a woman and her children to, in exchange for paying their transportation costs, they would have to come to New York and potentially then be contracted to your household for a certain period of time, or at least as long as it took to pay off the debt of their transportation. And, you know, I think it's interesting because I know that the Tenement Museum's new Under the One Roof tour, for instance, focuses on the 1948 Displaced Persons Act. And again, I think there's been a tendency not to think about humanitarian immigration acts as also having a kind of labor dimension or component. But if you jump ahead even to 1948, that congressional act also mandated that refugees had to have work lined up and housing provided in order to prevent them from becoming public charges. And so as sponsors, household employers in some ways seeking live-in domestics, which at this point was kind of an antiquated way of organizing an occupation, you know, could call on that act and then essentially sponsor refugees to work as servants. So in some ways there's a tradition of sort of thinking about refugees as exchanging opportunities for humanitarian relief in exchange for performing types of intimate labor that has been kind of stigmatized among Native workers for various reasons. And this will continue as well, and I'll show you another illustration from my book. This is a depiction of a group of New York women by their clothing and the illustration. You would understand them to be middle class or upper middle class, greeting a train of Chinese workers who, after the mayor of San Francisco issued an edict in 1880 that attempted to basically exile Chinese immigrants from that city, were going to be understood as refugees who were going to begin arriving in New York. So in this case, the humor magazine Puck is calling attention to this newly available supply of refugee labor that, you know, in its opinion would be kind of imminently coming to the Manhattan. You see this as late as 1891 in Puck. This is kind of a recurring cartoon that magazine contained. In this case, it kind of hypothesizes a group of different scenarios. The one in the center involves a group of women from Africa, or at least how they're imagined in the cartoonist's eyes, from the Middle East. On the left, in what looks to be a plaid dress, is actually in the cartoon described as a Sioux squaw or a Lakota woman. Keep in mind, this is only 3 months in 1891 after the massacre at Wounded Knee. So again, kind of thinking about how displacements of Native peoples would again open up a labor supply for domestic service in New York, in a sense, a kind of colonial imagination of how workers could be produced for this profession. The second major point I want to call attention to quickly is that when the federal government began passing exclusionary immigration laws from the 1870 onwards, it enforced them selectively and in ways that favored the entry of domestic workers from groups who under other terms might be excludable or inadmissible. In these instances, immigrants' ability to enter was tied to their willingness to accept contractual arrangements that they did not get to determine. With unaccompanied European women, immigrant inspectors used the likely to become a public charge provision, which enabled them to debar an immigrant they evaluated as incapable of providing for themselves, to compel arrivals into taking jobs where wages were below the prevailing rates. So, just to use one example from my book, in the cases of Lizzie and Maggie Farrell, who landed in Philadelphia in November 19 and were 23 and 19 years old respectively, inspectors detained the two Irish sisters who were, after learning that they were bound to New York on speculation. They had about $20 between them. In other words, they were going to hop on the train and go to New York and just look for work upon arrival. Instead of letting them go unaccompanied to New York, the two women were told that in order to enter, they had to agree to work for local Philadelphia employers, who, to the best of my knowledge, essentially were looking for low-skilled servants who they could pay for below market rate. So in other words, federal inspectors used this idea of who would become a public charge to, in essence, place immigrant women in professions where, as young Irish white women, they were understood to be kind of protected as gender dependents. The last point I want to just make, after the passage of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, Chinese immigrants who had worked in large numbers as domestics and cooks on the West Coast, as well as in cities like New York, could no longer enter the United States as immigrant laborers at all. Still, immigration officials found ways to allow for the temporary entries of Chinese servants, often Chinese servants who worked for missionaries, for American businessmen employed in places like China or the Philippines abroad, military officials, to come in as long as they were indemnified by bonds that essentially guaranteed that they would leave after a period of time rather than becoming permanent unauthorized immigrants. So the last photo I just want to show you, this is an immigrant by the name of Chan Chang, a Chinese servant who had actually been employed as a cook for a man by the name of Colonel King, while Colonel King was stationed in the Philippines outside of Manila, who was essentially indemnified for $500 and told that in order for him to come in and continue to work for King as a servant, King had to take out a bond guaranteeing he would leave. In other words, in some ways incentivizing King to keep him in a type of kind of captive situation, to not allow him to look for other work, for other jobs. I show you this picture because despite all of that, Chang actually did leave his employer, became an unauthorized or undocumented immigrant after deciding that he simply would no longer kind of tolerate the unfair working conditions that he was being subject to. So again, immigrants do take advantage of these laws, they do take advantage of exceptions and exercise a type of agency. In a sense, to just connect the past and the present before I wrap up, it's really not my expertise, but I think in respect to the present, I think it's actually essential and important to keep in mind that at least when we speak of undocumented workers employed in domestic service, it's important to remember who renders them disposable or exploitable. It's the federal government, in essence, controlling the ways in which labor markets function, and in a sense creating the kind of conditions in which workers can't speak out about situations of wage theft, of violent, abusive working conditions for fear of being deported. So I think it's essential to keep in mind how policies shape the terms and conditions under which contracts can occur and what powers that the respective parties in contract negotiations have. Thank you very much. Yep.
Hello. I also would like to thank Laura Lee for organizing this panel, and also I'm very flattered to be in such a great lineup of scholars and activists, and I thank you all for coming tonight. So I am going to talk about domestic work in the late 19th and early 20th century, which I think occupied a kind of awkward space in middle-class homes. It demanded heavy labor and it demanded long hours, but employers didn't really see domestic workers as workers, like factory workers or like shop workers. And they didn't see them as a defined working class. They also attached all kinds of expectations to domestic labor and domestic work that they did not attach to other kinds of labor. And in fact, domestic work was shaped as much by gendered family roles and notions of domesticity as it was by economic laws of supply and demand. And so one of the things I'm hoping that you'll think about today as I'm talking is about how ideas about gender, how ideas about race, shape ideas about what counts as labor and who counts as a worker and what counts as labor resistance. And so I should say at the outset that I'm going to be talking mostly about young, European, mostly Irish, but also some German and Scandinavian immigrant workers at the turn of the 20th century. In the South, this work would have been almost entirely done by African American women who earned an even lower wage than the workers that I'll be talking about today. Late 19th and early 20th century, European domestic workers were mostly in their teens and early 20s. Most would leave the occupation after marriage. And many of these young women had come to the United States alone, and what they were hoping for was to send money home to their impoverished families, and so the jobs they looked for were live-in positions, because then they wouldn't have to pay for room and board. And so this, in contrast, the African-American women who did this work in the South usually were married, they had their own families, and they returned to their families at the end of the day. So they did day work as opposed to live-in work. So I think one of the first questions is, what is it like to do domestic work? Employers often claimed that domestic work offered young women easy work for high wages. But live-in domestic workers put in 10 to 15 hours a day of heavy labor at very low pay. So for instance, Alexandra Rebienska, who was a Polish immigrant working in Brooklyn in 1911, she reported in her letters home, quote, "I do well, I have fine food, only I must work from 6 o'clock in the morning to 10 o'clock at night," unquote. And Rebienska's day was typical. An anonymous worker wrote to The Independent, for instance. She said, quote, "This may seem incredible, but from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. I don't get time to write so much as a postal card," unquote. So these workers often rose at 6 to fix breakfast, and they weren't done until they had cleaned the kitchen after dinner was over. Eileen Howard, who was a Finn working in New York, recalled having to do, quote, "an awful lot of heavy work" in her first job, where she began each day at 4:30 in the morning. And sometimes she devoted whole days to ironing. And of course, this is in the days when ironing took place with actual irons that you heated on the stove and burned your hands every 2 minutes. So this picture of domestic service as an occupation of low wages and poor working conditions was not at all how employers envisioned work in their homes. Because domestic work took place in private homes and was comprised of traditionally female labor, many reformers and other experts saw it as in some ways the perfect occupation for young women. They portrayed paid housework as offering young women moral uplift at the hands of middle-class guardians. So in other words, they were blurring the line between the work that mothers and daughters did in their own homes for free and the work that domestic workers were doing in someone else's home for a wage. In fact, you can hear it when you listen to them talk about it. So for instance, Christina Goodwin, who wrote advice books for women about how to manage their home, she reminded housekeepers, quote, "It is as offering a good home that domestic service makes its special claim," unquote. Middle-class employers, Goodwin wrote, provided working-class domestics, quote, "not just with food and shelter, but also a glow of kindly interest and the felt influence of a right view of life and its duties." So magazines, newspapers, employers, and writers of prescriptive literature literature lauded the middle-class home as a place where you could Americanize immigrants and teach working-class women the ideals of middle-class domesticity. The home in these formulations was totally unlike other more public workplaces, and middle-class women were totally unlike commercial employers who might employ people in factories or in shops. And in an ideal world, the middle-class home could offer these women pleasant work and also make them better, more moral people. But the problem for employers, of course, was that the reality they found in their kitchens just did not match that ideal. I'm going to switch to here. In a multitude of print sources in the 19th century, middle-class and wealthy employers complained that domestic workers were slovenly, lazy, drunk, sexually promiscuous, or dishonest. And I think Andy sort of touched on this earlier. And these problems were exacerbated by the fact that workers lived in employers' homes. They were present for family arguments, for marital spats, for moments of crisis. They cared for employers' children, but they didn't necessarily share employers' values or behave in the way that middle-class people wanted them to. And some of this is clearly tied to domestic workers' ethnicity. And I think you can see that clearly here. In the late 19th century, native-born Protestant Americans viewed the Irish as fundamentally and racially different, and definitely not quite white. You can see here, right, that this is clearly an ethnic stereotype. Fears of Irish Catholics secretly baptizing their employers' children in the middle of the night were rampant around New York. Catholicism was to employers a marker of immigrants' ethnic and racial inferiority. And I think, obviously now we perceive Irish people as simply white. But in the 1880s, I think what's interesting, what's important about these cartoons is that a reader would have immediately recognized these domestic workers as noticeably, visibly, and racially Irish. Moreover, I think images like these, right, where you can see the domestic worker on the right-hand side is ordering the lady of the house out of the kitchen, right, undermine the advice of writers like Christina Goodwin that employers could guide their workers in a maternal way. The power of employers to offer any kind of maternal guidance seemed questionable at best. And also, these cartoonists depicted domestic workers as fundamentally unfit for middle-class homes, and definitely racially unfit for the kind of familial relationship with Protestant employers. Employers and workers, therefore, saw their daily interactions very differently. So, for example, labor reformers and employers complained that in domestic employment offices, which in the 19th century were called intelligence offices, workers learned, quote, how to extract higher wages and unreasonable concessions. Now, of course, household workers probably didn't see these concessions as unreasonable. And domestic workers were helped in their negotiations with potential employers by having an audience of their friends. And here you can see a very uncomfortable middle-class couple looking for domestic workers on the Lower East Side in these tenement intelligence offices. You can see all the kids playing on the street and they're sort of coming out in their fancy dresses. So if a worker compromised or agreed to work for less in an intelligence office waiting room with all of her friends in the background, a reformer reported that, quote, her listening pals will guide her or accuse her of having a weak back or a broken spirit, unquote. So an employer stuck with the task of negotiating under these conditions complained, quote, if you can only pay moderate wages, you are snubbed, unquote. So while intelligence offices clearly made employers uncomfortable, they offered workers a sense of community, and I think importantly, a more level playing field on which to negotiate wages and working conditions. To employers, intelligence offices offered personal humiliation, but to workers, they were the best place to hold a labor negotiation. And I have a slide that is very similar, in fact, the same slide to the one that Andrew just showed you, because I think it does demonstrate the sort of that employers felt that they were on their back feet in employment offices. found that domestic workers were often not deferential, nor open to benevolent middle-class guardianship. One magazine writer, for instance, wrote that, that they had to, quote, slink half apologetically into the kitchen to have a finger, so to speak, in the pie. But the fact is that domestic workers were proud of their expertise in the kitchen. Cooks, cooking on a 19th century stove is complicated, and cooks constantly had to arrange dampers on stoves or place foods in strategic spots because the level of heat differed depending on where you put it. And so domestic workers saw the middle-class kitchen as a space where they, and not their employers, should be the experts. So, for instance, as the servant girls of Cambridge Place wrote to the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, quote, some ladies go into the kitchen and stick their noses in the pots and pans to see what is going on. Such a lady is not fit to live with, unquote. So given that middle-class women could not cook, largely, we might see kitchens as working-class spaces within middle-class homes. And employers also complained all the time about how often workers quit. And quitting was probably the easiest and most often used way for domestic workers to deal with working conditions that they didn't like. So, for instance, in 1 year, the Richards family had 6 different cooks. They had even more nannies. And so certainly leaving employers in a bind was probably the most satisfying way to quit. So sometimes they would leave right before a dinner party. Sometimes they'd leave just before breakfast. One morning in 1905, for example, a maid woke the Ashmores up to say, quote, she didn't think the place would suit her and that she was going. The Ashmores couldn't cook anything, and I think Grace Ashmore only learned to make coffee after she was married. And she begged the woman to stay and make her breakfast before she left. And I think that this is an important example because it demonstrates the ways in which domestic workers thought about their jobs as work, and middle-class women as employers, and not as maternal guardians. In quitting, they were rejecting the idea that they had some sort of familial obligation to employers to endure poor wages or poor working conditions. So although middle-class families did not think of their homes as workplaces, the home was in fact a site of labor conflict. What we see in these conflicts is in part domestic workers defining the home as a workplace. In intelligence offices, domestic workers argued for a fair wage. They demanded they defined middle-class kitchens as workplaces. They quit when working conditions weren't to their liking. Meanwhile, although employers often talked about a familial relationship with, quote, servants, they often found it pretty hard to view workers who they saw as ethnically different as part of their own families. And at the same time, they also resisted paying them a higher wage or regulating hours, and they consistently, throughout the 20th century, opposed efforts to do that. So these are not the sort of classic clashes between capital and labor that you might see in sort of broader labor histories. But I think that taking them seriously as a form of labor negotiation helps us to think critically about work taking place not just in steel mills or in auto factories, but in private settings like the home. These labor negotiations may have focused on kitchen space or religion, but they were also about what counts as work and what counts as a workplace. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
So I just also want to extend my thanks to Laura and to the staff here at the Tenement Museum for inviting us and for organizing this program today. I want to start by talking about how I came to this topic. I've written a book about domestic worker organizing, and I started to become involved as a supporter of the domestic worker rights movement in about 2004 and 2005. And I was inspired at that time by the activism of Domestic Workers United that Christine Lewis was one of the founders of. This was a coalition that emerged in 1999 or 2000, based in New York City. And I was really impressed by this multiracial coalition led by women of color, mostly immigrant women from all over the world, from Mexico, from Trinidad, from Barbados, from El Salvador, from Bangladesh, from Haiti. These amazing women were marching in the streets. They were shaming abusive employers. They were testifying about their experiences. And they were lobbying the state for a domestic workers' bill of rights. This organizing that I observed at the time was really a counter-narrative to everything that I was reading in the history books and the scholarship and reading in the mainstream newspapers. So it got me interested in thinking about why our understanding of the labor movement is so constricted. And it's in part because our understanding of the labor movement has been historically defined by white male labor. So I wanted to write something about the history of domestic worker organizing and to write something that I thought would be meaningful and helpful to the contemporary movement. In my book, which covers the post-war period, I look at the organizing of domestic workers as an alternative labor movement. It challenged conventional wisdom about how work was defined, as Vanessa said, and they also pioneered untested labor organizing strategies. These were activists who were rooted in the civil rights movement, who believed that race was deeply intertwined with the occupation, which for them had come to denote both black servitude as well as white exploitation. So for them, modern-day racism was symbolized not by the segregated lunch counter, but by the figure of the mammy. They refused to enter through the back door, to take hand-me-downs from their employers in lieu of payment, or to serve at the beck and call of their employers. They pushed for a contractual relationship that specified the tasks for which workers were responsible, and that was a way to overturn this culture of servitude that was so prominent in the occupation. They sought training and certification programs, and they chose the name household technicians to denote what they believed was the professional nature of their occupation. And they fought for amendments to the Fair Labor Standards Act, which was federal minimum wage legislation that domestic workers had been excluded from since the 1930s. And these local groups eventually came together in 1971, and they formed the first ever national domestic workers' rights organization in the country. And I think their organizing is especially important because for much of the history of this country, and if you read a lot of labor history, domestic work is considered an unorganizable occupation, and this is a term that labor historians use. There were, of course, real barriers to labor organizing. These were workers who were isolated employees who worked in private homes, and the typical labor models didn't apply. Mainstream labor organizing was premised on collective workplaces and recruitment on the shop floor. But domestic workers couldn't be organized in their places of employment. They couldn't mingle with one another in the break room or on the assembly line. It wasn't always clear who hired domestics, and even when you knew who hired them, it was next to impossible to organize them in their workplaces. But there was also mythology and popular perceptions that inhibited the organizing. Domestic workers were sometimes understood as content because of the assumptions that their work was, quote unquote, a labor of love, or that domestic workers were, quote, one of the family. Or they were considered unorganizable because they were so disempowered and victimized that they actually needed middle-class people to speak on their behalf. So given this history and given the complications of the organizing, how did these women in the post-war period organize? Well, in part because of the particularities of their occupation, they developed what I think of as really innovative models of labor organizing, and I'm just going to mention a few. First, as Vanessa talked about, they began to draw attention to the home as a workplace. So there's an artificial divide between public and private that has generated assumptions that the home is not really a workplace but is a site of refuge from the harsh, competitive, economic and political transactions of the public sphere. As many feminist scholars have argued, domestic worker organizing vividly illustrates that the home is in fact a site of labor and exploitation. Domestic workers also were outside the boundaries of traditional labor unions. They were excluded from mainstream organizing. They didn't have the right to organize because of the National Labor Relations Act, passed in the 1930s, which excluded domestic workers. So they had to find other ways, other kinds of alliances besides the traditional labor unions. They worked with civil rights groups, they worked with feminist groups, they worked with employer organizations, and they developed community-based groups. And so they were the forerunners of what we might call today social movement unionism, with the aim of building not just union membership, but collective power. They also advocated state-based rather than employer-granted labor rights, since they changed employers frequently. State-based benefits protected all workers, regardless of who employed them, or whether or not each individual worker was able to negotiate generous contracts. So the passage of amendments to the Fair Labor Standards Act is one example of the ways in which they push for state-based legislation, as is the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights that was passed here in New York about a decade ago. And they did eventually win minimum wage legislation after nearly 50 years of exclusion. Since domestic workers couldn't organize in their places of employment, they used public spaces as sites of organizing. So Carolyn Reed, who was a domestic worker and an organizer on the Upper East Side, for example, reached out to private household workers by going to bus stops, to service entrances, to laundry rooms, and to neighborhood gourmet shops. The shopkeepers in the dormant on Lexington Avenue regularly sent workers her way. In fact, the Village Voice called her a quote-unquote natural organizer at large. Household workers also relied on storytelling as a base-building strategy. It was not evident that domestic workers were a political constituency, so that had to be created. Storytelling became a means to build a collective identity and to foster solidarity. Geraldine Miller, who lived in the Bronx, recounted hearing stories from women who stood on Burnside Avenue during the Great Depression. As they waited to be hired for the day by employers, they would quote, the employers would quote, sometimes ask to see your knees, because the women with the worst scarred knees were hired first because they looked like they worked the hardest. Although Miller never experienced this herself, the stories were transformative for Miller. As she put it, this is just one of the things that kind of woke me up. As Miller immersed herself in the movement, the stories of the Bronx slave market became part of her organizing toolbox. And she shared the anecdote with other household workers as a way to build solidarity, but also to suggest that no household worker should ever have to scrub floors on their hands and knees. Part of what I learned through writing this book was that if we center women, and especially women of color, we generate a very different perspective of the history of labor that expands our notion of how workers organize. It prompts us to consider labor organizing not through a narrow class lens, but to integrate into it an analysis of race, gender, and ethnicity. I think that domestic worker organizing, both historically and today, offers a model for workers in other occupations who are experiencing very similar working conditions. With the Uberization of the economy, we've seen a rise in contingent workers, in part-time workers, temporary workers, as well as quote-unquote independent contractors. American workers today are much more mobile and are more likely to be isolated employees without benefits and labor protections. In this context, both the history and the current examples of domestic worker organizing can offer a model for how precarious workers can come together and mobilize power.
How is everyone? Hello? Could I indulge you for a minute? Here's what I want you to do. sing this refrain. I want you to sing it back to me, okay? Before I do these poems. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Let's do that again. It's okay for us to do the talking and you want to sit back and glean, but it's okay to stretch your voices too. Yeah? Hold on. Hold on. Listen, sing it like you believe it. We're in a tough season right now. So sing it like you believe it, because we have to hold on, and we have to hold on to each other in communities for what our academe just spoke about. It's needed, especially for the immigrants today. We're terrified, we're fearful. So let's do this and listen. We believe that the sound and the trumpets will break walls. It has been written, and it's also a fact today. If we hold on in communities, our chants and our songs will break walls. He will have no power for those walls. So let's do this again. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. I'm gonna board a big gray bus and carry my love from town to town. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Hold on. Thank you. 5:30 a.m. Lone woman traipses down a melancholy numbered street in a starch-stiff parsley scrub. Patterns vivid. Uniform is required there. Streaks of light from humble lamppost reveals babbling baby anchored to her fertile apron front. Baby boobs. Rambunctious rats in search of something, anything, wrestle for space on dismal sidewalk. Pompous alley cats choosing to stay whom they serve look the other way. A familiar dollar van pulls up alongside her with a melodic calypso cadence, like sugar cane, sweet, sweet. Said, only 2 stops. Babysitter first and then subway. I must get to Bastor Road and North Plaza Station no later than 7:30. A pristine place where old money gets to pay caregiver. Which reminds me, the guy with philosophy and aphorisms dripping from his lip would say, it's not Bastow Road, it's Bastow. B-A-R-S-T-O-W. Bastow Road. 1 minute late, them people stiff you $50. Considering I wasn't hired to launder linen 600 count, steam steak right, just right, plant peonies in ornate pots, walk dog, doe-eye dogs, twice a day. Trader Joe, Costco, Post Office, UPS, FedEx, only God know what they ask for next. Innocence with first whisper fear didn't spell all this. 11 hours to boot, no benefits, no overtime. At exactly 5:46 a.m., a conductor's voice blared through a decrepit loudspeaker. Stand clear of the closing doors. Men in hard hats, neon green, orange shirt, emblazoned SEIU 1199, local 22 212 558 79178 550 TWU, weary steel tip boot. Oppressed dungarees with pockmarked sleeve. One man snow. A fresh face kid with cute dimples, slightly worn construction boots said, we build this city. Oh yeah, we build this city. My next poem is price of migration is equal to slave labor, a pantu. Cotton picking days ain't over. Madam List, crow, glow, crow. Light housekeeping, walk dog. Let baby be first priority. Madam List, grow, glow, grow. Island woman, warm spirit, vexed. Let baby be first priority. US dollar controls Manhattan East. Island woman, warm spirit, vexed. Scoop shit from shitty sidewalk. US dollar controls Manhattan East. Unlike Tobago's tobacco sunny soil. Scoop shit from shitty sidewalk. Times classified ad never spell this. Unlike Tobago's tobacco sunny soil. Work never been this hard. Times classified ad never spell this. Price of migration means yes ma'am. Work never been this hard. Baby, unrelated burden, pushed along Avenue Dank. Price of migration means yes ma'am. Light housekeeping, walk dog, baby, unrelated burden, pushed along Avenue Dank. Cotton picking days ain't over. I wrote this poem in 2002. We were lobbying the city council to look at agencies and how they inform workers who are looking for work in 2003. But this poem came 2002, and it was an epiphany. It was also something I endured, and being the best that I could be. Being a 5-star caregiver, but being the best that I could be. And it just happened, Housekeepers, house sitters, au pairs, nannies, babysitters, caregivers, bottle scrubbers, window washers, homemakers, live-in helpers, dog walkers, companions, plumber, landscaper, custodial engineers, soldiers, warriors, madres y padres, mamas y papas, sister friend, super sister friend, supermodel look modern day mammies, confidant and friend. Dynamic woman, woman like immortal trees, ageless, stoic, divas, invisible women, decision makers, pre-K teachers, superwoman you ain't. Mary Poppins was fictitious. Juggles 12 bottles standing like decorated soldiers along pearl pink enamel sink. Bellies coated with remnants of weekend's rancid milk. Diapers, A&D, Dr. Leish's how-to. Finger paints, pancakes, Skittles, scones, dustpans, Swifter. Did someone say light housekeeping? Ever such a thing? Tantrums, timeout, chronic fatigue, mood swing syndrome. Stylish McLarens navigate serious sidewalks. Eerie eyes grow out of grates, probe existence here. Passerby asks, is that all you could do? Tied to remember in long lines, longer than Larder Jacobs saw at Food Emporium. Interviews? 4 times this week. How many ways to clean poo? Count the ways. Mammograms delayed. Van Thursday underscored in Crayola red. Apple picking along the Hudson. PTA put off to serve filet mignon, diced cheese, blue cheese, cream cheese, all kind of cheese in flamboyant rooms. Clear crystal chandeliers hang. Extra $1. Seal sliver of rustin galvanized, where star apple sun anoints placid palm blades in colorful calypso air. Ballet, museum miles, movies, may be the Hamptons, play dates, play space and fate, bedtime, little engine that could 5 times tonight. 1955, Mother Goose Nursery Jim Crow was no goldfinch who could crow. Destiny of 10 little nigger boys uncertain. Mama's burdened breast, once erect, like full cantaloupes, genuflect earthward, as if pleading before God to have mercy, emptied of its morsel by folks and innocents on plantations at Easy Street, whose fangs of affluence clutch, sucks without pity and rejects. Maggots bore hole in consciences, reward with mere pittance, pocket change for fourth grader at York. And the last one I'm gonna do, are you having a good time? Yeah. Thank you. And the last one I'm gonna do, it's a question somebody asked me sometime in 2007. Push that stroller, sister, push that stroller, said the guy with a salt and pepper mustache, a LeBron James look-alike. The other guy to his left, pretty cantankerous and fired up, shouted, "I didn't know you used to do slave work." He had only seen me this once in the frozen aisle section of Food Emporium. You'd think we were friends. Those words ached as I pushed the alabaster baby with a cute whisper first year along narrow strip of Central Park asphalt on a frigid Friday. It was my 10th month on the job caring for innocence, affluence, and privilege on the Tony Upper East Side. A world far away from the one I knew, where hummingbirds, carefree, whistle colorful calypso beneath fertile mango trees. I laundered linens, secrets, curtains, socks with caked on muds while preparing lavish meal with fancy goat cheese, brie cheese, and Sunday best pasta. Oh, how the scent of cheese made me nauseous. By the way, it was vogue in the house I worked for. There was no time to play hopscotch. On Mondays, I doubled as the janitor and painter. On Tuesday, I would repair broken toys and things. My world revolved around this family waking and sleeping moments. The words came back to haunt. I didn't know you used to do slave work. It sure was. It felt like it. My time belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Unpack. My early years of schooling, reciting by rote, R.L. Stevenson, "O Mary, go and call the cattle homes" in pretty plaid uniform, beneath a saffron sun, didn't prepare me to be a domestic worker, or so I thought. A literacy teacher, perhaps. It wasn't to be. The tales of abuse and being propositioned by wealthy, greasy-ass men, from women who yearn for some good curry and island pilau on cold benches as leaves fall around them cry. Those long days shuffling children from school, play date and fate for less than minimum wage and thank you, as if thank you could pay the rent here and cover the cost of auntie staying at the nursing home on the rolling hills of picturesque Tobago. The years of suffering from wage theft, fatigue and burnout from taking care of family and affluence on plantation at Easy Street. Families who referred to me as family but didn't treat me as such, prepared me for the next phase of my life in the capacity of lead organizer, cultural coordinator with Domestic Workers United, an organization of immigrant women of color who fought for and won a Bill of Rights in New York State in 2010. I fought a valiant fight and continue to fight that fight by standing up and letting my voice be heard wherever it needs to be heard, that there is protection for women in an industry that is not protected by most labor laws, the domestic workers industry. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your scholarship, for your activism, for your poetry, for giving us really a vivid image of what this work is like. I want to open it up to the audience, and I know if anyone has questions.
I'll ask a question.
Sure.
So I
taking up the context of Filipino workers in Hong Kong. I have a lot of friends that grew up in Hong Kong. Some grew up with domestic helpers in the house, some didn't. And today they have, mommy Facebook groups and whatnot that are primarily expats from maybe England or the US or, wherever. And they kind of share these same frustrations about their domestic workers that they did, here in New York. And I guess, how do you bridge the gap? I mean, the domestic workers themselves may organize a little bit better and they may have more community resources and organizing power, but what I see from kind of these little snippets into their world via these, online chat groups is, they echo themselves and they may think, I don't treat my domestic helper this way, even though they might, because they're not considering it, as you noted, as a true workplace. So I guess, how do you finally take that conversation that's happening within domestic workers and kind of get the employers to hear it in a way that resonates with them and that they kind of accept that they're part of that paradigm?
So when we went for the Bill of Rights, so DW was born in 1990, 2000, and there was a big conversation around the work being done. I remember in 1999, women saying, who do we go to when this man just blew his cigarette in my face? And I felt a part of those women's pain, yeah. And there is a lot of, the beautiful thing about DWU, and as you asked that question, and how important an essential community is having allied groups, churches and friends, J-French, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, who carries this conversation into the synagogue, into their enclave, whether it's Parks Loop or the Upper West Side, or again in the synagogues, and have these town hall meetings about what it means to be conscionable, because domestic work is really work. It's work going to, it's work. Yes? So having allies and friends and mobilizing and organizing, even our sector of workers, having monthly meetings, learning to push back, having legal recourse too, especially for women who have, wages have been stiffed, right? Or women who feel that they don't have recourse, or women who are undocumented and living in the shadows and is really terrified. We have these safe spaces. In numbers, listen, this is my mantra. When you fight, you win. When you fight in community, will that circle ever be unbroken? So it's important that parents who might slip aside a little bit, and we talk about the definition of family. And if we're family, we kind of do right, although some family do not treat us right too, right? But the idea is family. Your kids are your prized possession, and this woman who's coming in to take care of your, and by the way, this woman who's coming in is a 5-star, okay? She's a, let me just plug this, she's a 5-star, I know this. How could you not conscionably do this thing? Or sit, or, I mean, I remember having to say to parents, parents who say to me, well, what's happening next door? This is how my friend treats her caregiver. Say, listen, let's establish this thing right now. I am not working for a friend next door, I'm working for you. So it's being able to speak it through and standing up. And again, I can't reiterate more and more how essential communities are across the board, and having relationships with this person who you don't know from a canopy, who comes into your home to have your home pristine, to take care of listen, she carries your secret. She carries your secret. How could you not? And I implore women too, that if it's not a conducive situation, leave. And the beautiful thing about it, we have this huge coalition of women who may not speak English or whatever language. We have the Southeast Asian women who are networking and mobilizing their sector of workers, the Philippine migrant workers here, right, who are taking those stories abroad too. I mean, we talk about stories even in the Philippines, even in China, even in Hong Kong, where liaisoning and through the National Domestic Workers Alliance, having these great conversations. Yes?
So yeah, thank you, Christina. Thank you for that question. I think it's a really important one. justify their treatment of domestic workers through dehumanization, right? Or through thinking of them as different kinds of human beings, and and I think that Andrew's work illustrates this very, very clearly, that somehow these people are not quite like you. They don't need exactly what you need. They might still be human, but they need less than you. And so there's a way in which I think racism and the categorization of human beings is really central to how middle-class employers can justify their maltreatment of domestic workers, their underpayment, the wage theft that is so prevalent in this occupation. And so I think historically, and Vanessa has written about this too, but historically, domestic workers have always allied with employers. That's been a really central part of the ways in which they have won important victories, such as the Fair Labor Standards Act. It was through alliance with employers. And the current movement, as Christine said, has also allied with a number of different employer groups. There's also on the national level a group called Hand in Hand, which is a group made up of employers. And I'll just say, I think it's very important, but I also think it's really important to center the voices of domestic workers. And so the three of us up here are academics, and hopefully you got something out of what we said. I think it's really different to hear from someone like Christine, who's actually been in the trenches, who's been doing the work. And I think that as middle-class folks who are not domestic workers, we really need to give the leadership to those people who are most directly impacted.
So I think I just want to sort of echo a couple of things that Christine has already said, and that is, number one, that domestic work is often seen as unskilled labor, right? And so, my book, when I talk about domestic workers in the 1940s, you have employers who are who are also politically active and are involved in all these women's organizations that are working for labor reforms. And when they're working on a bill to bring domestic workers a minimum wage and maximum hours, what you see a lot of employers saying is, well, okay, but do I have to pay her through the night when she's sleeping in the same room with my child? Because of course they farmed out the labor of getting up in the middle of the night to the woman who works in their home. So there's a way in which they're just not able to see that work as skilled work, even though, as I sort of mentioned, right, none of those women could cook. Right, so if they didn't have this person to come in and do this work and produce these sort of elaborate meals, they would not eat. And when their domestic workers left, they often ate Welsh rarebit, which is essentially a 19th century word for grilled cheese, right? Night after night after night, because they couldn't make anything else. So I think the idea that this is skilled work is really important. I would also echo the ways in which domestic worker organizing has often relied on alliance, and I think that you can see that. I think, Premilla has also written about the Welfare Rights Organization, and they also made those kinds of alliances as well. But Dora Jones, who was a domestic worker from Queens, who organized a domestic workers union during the Depression, she also reached out to synagogues and churches to try to talk to employers in their places of worship and to make a case that they should be signing employment contracts with domestic workers. And so I think that those are common strategies that have carried through time.
I'll just add to your specific example as well, right? So a Filipino woman working in Hong Kong, I think it speaks to how this is also an issue of global laborers' rights. And so, that's a great example in part because, Filipino women, both in the Philippines and abroad, have actually really lobbied the government of the Philippines essentially to sort of view them as an important, and again, you have to be really kind of cautious when you use this language, but as in essence a type of commodity that's exported, right? And again, that's not to suggest that they're not, laborers with agency, right? But they're backed by the government viewing them as valuable sources of remittances who therefore deserve certain protections as a kind of precondition of them migrating. And this is based on the fact that a lot of governments, I think Hong Kong maybe, or China at this point, right, have specific contractual kind of relationships in place with the Philippines and other sending states of migrants about what, privileges and favors, in essence, kind of jumping up the queue to enter, right? Even in the United States, if we expand this to care work more generally, right? The U.S. to this day has laws in place that if you agree to work at a hospital, for instance, right, you can kind of jump to the front of the line in terms of getting a work visa. there are international conventions in place. The United Nations, through the International Labor Organization, or ILO, ratified, I think, back in 2011, a Convention 189, which is supposed to be a global Bill of Rights for domestic workers. And again, it's easy to be, I think, cynical about the United Nations and its ILO's ability to potentially actually enforce those Bill of Rights, but it's an important and absolutely essential start. I know our colleague Jennifer Fish, who's written on this, kind of describes how even allowing domestic workers to express their concerns, what they need as workers, in the kind of hallowed halls of the ILO in Geneva, right? That's an incredibly important kind of moment for making these workers visible in ways that traditionally they just haven't been able to, or haven't been given the space to be visible in that way.
How have you been able, or are you guys using technology and the internet and social media as a way of organizing besides going to these like physical communities? And how effective has that been, in rallying? Because almost, I think everyone has a cell phone no matter what type of work you're doing.
Yes, so there's a lot of, there's a pocket, while we have our movement, Domestic Workers United and other groups, there are little groups that are sprouting up, that's online, and who folks could reach out, not just DWU, there are little social groups as well, who are celebrating things like Annie Paloozas and, getting ready to go to Philadelphia, I think this weekend, and so the word is, the social media has become that big vehicle right now to reach each other. But the idea is that we have this space where folks could come to if they feel that they're hurting, if they feel that, again, things aren't going right, they could come physically to the office. But there are little pockets and areas where people are speaking to each other outside of DW. And then if it's too much, they reach out to the national or the local groups on the ground.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. And I've seen Christine in action doing her organizing. And I think one thing to remember is that domestic workers are a very vulnerable population. Some of them are undocumented, and even if they're not undocumented, they're vulnerable economically. It's possible in this particular climate, even if you're documented, you could be deported, you could be detained, there's police harassment, there's all kinds of vulnerabilities that they deal with every single day. And so I think, in terms of social media, that's a very impersonal way to organize. And what I've seen, with Christine and with other organizers is that it's generally face-to-face, that you have to know who you're talking to. You have to trust the people who are organizing you, and that trust is generally not built online. That trust is built face-to-face. That trust is built because your best friend knows somebody else who's also being victimized or exploited, and they will talk to that individual. So I think, unlike other kinds of organizing that we might see happening now online, that for domestic workers it really does have to happen face-to-face for the most part. But I do think there's a role for technology in that we need to spread the word, right? And we need to talk to employers through social media, through Facebook. We need to raise awareness that domestic workers do in fact have rights. And if you're violating the rights of a domestic worker, you're breaking the law. And so I think there's a role for technology, but I think a lot of the base building happens in terms of one-on-one.
I'll just add real quick. I think it's a really interesting question. I know there's examples from 19th century San Francisco where Chinese domestic workers would, in a sense, have a common knowledge that if you were to write a kind of reference about your employer, you might carve some characters in under the sink. And that's where a future domestic would look to kind of find knowledge on what types of conditions in California was Chinese men mainly they might encounter. And so I'm going to do the kind of classic academic move where I say, that would be a kind of really interesting dissertation project. But, because I actually do know that immigrant restaurant workers, for instance, have actually used online technologies and platforms and various places to kind of post really important and crucial information about restaurants that engage in wage theft or that, don't promise pay that was offered originally. And so, again, I don't know with domestic workers to what extent that's occurring, but I think it'd actually be interesting to research and kind of look into.
Can I just say this? Let me give you an example. I have been organizing for the past 17 years, right? And you're hearing me?
Yes.
Yeah, I've been organizing for the past 17 years, right? With Domestic Workers United. And I would work for folks, employers, whose business it wasn't to know that I was organizing. I would give women flyers. And one of the things I found out with giving women flyers, most times they were fired. Because from the time you start to unionize and put people in the rights, people kind of say, all right, flag goes up. Who's mobilizing you? Who's telling you? People are most times victimized for the truth, right? And I remember doing the Steve Colbert report and going from my employer's home to the radio, to the studio. And she had no idea. And I'm talking about 10 or 11 years later. And then when I went to the Stephen Colbert report, everybody from every nation called. And she said to me, Christina, I didn't know you organized on such a big scale. But my point in issue is that I didn't want it to interfere with my job, and it was something separate. It wasn't for her. While it was also for her, it was for me as well. It was more for me and my kinfolks who were working in the shadows and really being afraid, being afraid of accepting a flyer. So yeah, to reiterate what Premilla just said, nothing beats face-to-face, because people could talk behind the scenes. I mean, I became stronger because I had nothing to lose but chains. I really had to be the voice of that woman who was afraid to come into the office. It was me carrying those women's story, still carrying those women's story. It's my passion, it's my calling. Those women, and by the way, those women may never, listen, those women may never come. They might go to a boat ride in a purple dress, a green dress every summer. They mightn't come. And that is respect and repose too for women who are really sulking and in the shadows. But nothing beats being able to carry that truth, speak that truth to power, and look that person in the face, or go to the CUNY Law Center with a worker. What are we willing to risk? Fear. Fear itself? What are we willing to risk is the question. We are already here, whoever we are, right? COINTELPRO is somewhere, there's somebody looking, Big Brother's always looking somewhere. So what is there to fear? Right? And I mean, we could look at Ravi. I don't know if some of you all know Ravi, the Trinidadian guy who was about to be deported back to Trinidad, where I'm from. But how important his community came out to love him. I mean, council and city councillors were willing to throw themselves on the line. So what are we willing to risk in this fight for equal justice, especially for tier worker who has been excluded from labor rights? The Fair Labor Standard Act and the National Labor Relations Act, but yet is working to have, yet is working to ensure that somebody is able to leisure play and work. How big is that? Why are we afraid? And we should, and not just us should be stepping out. People in here who have employers as friends or nannies or people who, college students who are going to should take up that mantle as well. Because many college students are trying to help their parents pay this tantamount tuition fee, and they double as nannies and caregivers at nights. So it's beyond that. It's just beyond the immigrant woman, But would we let fear step in the way? Would we let fear hinder us? Would we let fear prevent us from going? Because let me just say this: if we don't go, we don't get nothing. Yeah? If we don't go, we stand on the corner, we proselyte and we preach. But as long as we don't put our feet to the metal or the pedal, we get nothing. So yeah, while social media is that thing about touching each other, when I talk about the song we just sang just now, keeping our eyes on the prize of board in that great big bus, and we see what's happening in this political year, in this political climate, this whole kind of draconian law, this man wants to change law, And we're all immigrants in this life. We're all immigrants in this life. We're here for a certain amount of time, all of us. We're all immigrants in this life. But we need each other to go hand in hand in this journey. And we need to do it face to face.
I'm curious if you foresee a rise in demand for domestic workers, given over the last few decades of more women joining the workforce and double income, specifically in the New York area.
I will let others chime in, but I would say that the way that people use domestic work has perhaps changed, but I think domestic workers have long been sort of seen as central to middle-class homes. You know, in the 19th century, the kind of labor that domestic work entailed was very heavy work, right? I have a whole section on that I only had 10 minutes, so I couldn't give you the long-winded version of how long it takes to do laundry in the 19th century. Essentially, the whole day. That's why they called it Blue Monday, both because you used bluing to keep your colors bright, and also because it made you so depressed that you felt blue. And so I think most families hired domestic workers. There's some discussion about that it fell off after 1910, but I think actually what happens is that the labor becomes casualized and it's not captured by the census. And so I think now there's a different way that people think about domestic work and the kinds of workers they hire and what they ask them to do when they're there. But you know, in the 19th century, if you want to have a beautiful parlor and you want someone answering the door, you would hire domestic workers, and the labor, and often it's sort of a rush to the bottom in terms of how little you can pay them.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add briefly to what I think Vanessa kind of explained really nicely. I mean, there's also this kind of techno-utopianism that runs through domestic labor. So every time there's a new invention, the electric vacuum cleaner, refrigeration, right, the kind of discourse or the discussions that you then see is, well, we're going to be able to rely less and less on humans, again, these, you know, potentially undesirable women from unknown origins that we're suspect of, right? We're going to be able to minimize the amount of time they spend at home, right? So, you know, as much as domestics are able to celebrate this idea of living out, where they're not actually living under the same roofs of employers, employers often also tout that as an opportunity to kind of establish barriers by which the home is protected. And so I think there's always this kind of belief that in some ways domestics are a necessary evil, right? I mean, to be very cynical in some ways about employers' kind of view of domestic labor, and often it's technology that's the kind of solution to that problem.
Can I just say one more thing? I think this also goes back to the question about whether domestic work is work, right? Because I think so often people, you know, all of this stuff about feminism where women should just lean in, they should opt in, right? The way that you lean in and you opt in is that you have to replace the labor in the home because that work is work and somebody needs to do it. You can't just leave your kids alone at home. Somebody has to do that work. And so much of that requires somebody to come in and do that work. And similarly, you know, even in the earlier period, if you wanted to be politically active, if you wanted to go to a club, if you wanted to visit people, someone had to do that work. And I think very often people sort of think of that work as not work or as invisible labor, that it'll get done somehow. But actually, I think if you think about it, domestic work is what makes capitalism possible. Right? If you don't have domestic workers doing that work, the entire economy would crash, because it's not like your garbage can that you could just sort of let pile up, right? That work needs to be done and it needs to be done now.
And I'll just add a couple things. One is, we always see a rise in domestic work when there's greater inequality, right? Because labor theoretically becomes cheaper. So even people who don't have to hire a domestic worker will hire a domestic worker because they have access to cheap labor. New York City is one of the most unequal cities in the world when it comes to income. So yes, and that's been intensifying over the past several decades. So because of that, I think we're seeing more and more domestic workers being hired in places like New York City. The other thing I would say is, you know, I think it's important to connect, you know, to pick up on what Vanessa said, it's important to connect sort of how we understand feminism and middle-class women's success to domestic work. And there's a lot of conversation today about middle-class women, about women being in power, and for good reason. With Donald Trump in power, we need to think about alternatives. And there are a lot of women who've been very upset with him and his political leadership, who are entering politics now, who are thinking about women's leadership in a broader way. But those are middle-class women, right? And as Vanessa said, we have to ask the question, well, okay, if those are the women who are going to be in power, who's doing their work at home, okay? And one of the things I've learned from Domestic Workers United is that it's not that there's anything wrong with the labor. It's not that you shouldn't hire somebody to do this work for you, but that you just need to pay them decently and you need to treat them with respect, right? And so I think all those women who are going out doing wonderful things in this world, who are becoming politicians, who are becoming academics, who are becoming lawyers and doctors, really need to think about the value of the labor of the people who they're hiring to do the work in the home.
Last question.
Can you speak for a minute about how the employer becomes the ally? Because, as you were just saying, it's mostly women who really are employing the domestic workers, and they don't seem to be allies of the workers, from what I've seen.
So I'll talk about the 1960s and the 1970s, and that was a moment when we saw the emergence of a really powerful middle-class women's movement in this country, and women who felt that they were tied to the home, they had no options in the labor force, who began to say, we want to work and we want to work outside the home. Now, that argument by itself, of course, erases the fact there are large numbers of poor working-class women who had always worked outside the home. But that movement of middle-class women from the home to the labor force, I think, was really important. In that process, some of those women really denigrated household work by saying, this work isn't good enough for me. It's not fulfilling. And Betty Friedan is one of those. She said, vacuuming does nothing to stimulate your mind. I don't want to vacuum. I don't want to raise children. I want to have a job. I want to be a professional. That very statement is a denigration of domestic work. It devalues domestic work. So when the domestic workers' rights movement emerged in the late 60s and early 70s, they confronted this head on, and they went to feminists and they said, listen, this is work that you have not been paid for, because when it's your own house, you're not getting paid for that household labor. This is work that you have not been getting paid for because it's been devalued. This is work that we're underpaid for because it's devalued. So how can we work together? How can we both understand the ways in which the devaluation of household labor has had a negative impact on all of us as workers because of our low pay, and on you as housewives because you've never been paid for it. So I think there's a way we can think about the labor of social reproduction as something that unites women of all backgrounds, of all class backgrounds, as a kind of as a central node to develop an alliance for both middle class and domestic workers. I don't know if that fully answers your question.
All right, I want to thank Christine, Premilla, Vanessa, and Andy for being here, for sharing your experiences, your story, your work, for giving us a lot to think about when it comes to this work. Also, a lot to think about when it comes to being allies as well. I want to thank you all for being here tonight, and I hope you come back. Check our website for other tenement talks. We're still open for another half hour or so, so if you are interested in learning more about this subject, Andy, Vanessa, and Premilla's books are for sale downstairs, and so I'm sure they'd be happy to talk with you about the work that they've done. But thank you all very much.